I do think the standard of performance has to up. I do think the variation has to up, and so that, of course, that puts pressure on the coaches. But that's their job. That's what they have to try and deliver on.
It sure is. So a couple of weeks back, I think you caught some of the piece, but for anybody who didn't, we had Tom English on the show. Tom English is with BBC Scotland, but he's written a new book called This Is Your Everest, The Lions, the Springboks and the Epic Tour of 1997. I must say, and I said it to Tom, I had thought that this tour had been well excavated. I didn't need to know a whole lot more about the tour. But actually, it was a brilliant chat with him, and the book has loads of stuff in it that I just did not realise, not least about the South African perspective. So something I wanted to ask you about is that the years 95 to 97, when we think of South African rugby over here, I mean, in our heads, not a whole lot went on. They won the World Cup, then the Lions Tour was 2 years later. It turns out, and I'm sure you were aware of this at the time, but it turns out all hell was breaking loose in a number of ways. Some of it, just very unfortunate. They lost their coach, Kitch Christie. Ultimately, he passed away with leukemia in 98, so he had to leave the setup, and they basically hadn't lost a game under Christie. So that was a massive, massive issue. Politically, things weren't good. Fans started waving the apartheid flag again, and members of cabinet were saying they didn't support the team anymore. And Andrew Marcraft, one of their coaches, had to resign in disgrace for things he was saying, racial slurs, very, very messy. Johan Ackerman test positive for steroids in May of 97. And there are pay disputes as well, as in the younger players are getting far less money than the World Cup winners, and that's not a great dynamic in a team. All of this stuff, and more, by the way, is bubbling along. And then the chief issue, if you listen to the players, and that's where I'm going to with this, is that their 37-year-old coach, Carl du Plessis, who by all accounts was an outstanding player in the 80s, he was ill-equipped for that job, and they were unanimous that he was really not up to scratch. They all say, like, a lovely man, but really not at the races and just nowhere near the standard required at 37 years of age to coach them. And so the point I wanted to put to you is that everybody from, there's James Dalton, Teichmann says it as well. There's quite a few players who all say, basically, we gifted that tour to that Lions squad. A few of them say they didn't really rate the Lions squad. Basically, if we hadn't been in complete disarray, at our absolute worst, we would have won that series, and we should have won that series. And that's very much how we feel about it. That was the overwhelming response from the players. So a few questions. Did you know that's how they felt? Were they open about that, do you remember, at the time, or has that seeped out more recently?
Well, they weren't particularly... there wasn't a huge amount of interaction with them during the tour, apart from, I'm going to say, apart from beating them. There was definitely conversations afterwards, and I had it with a few of the players afterwards. We would have looked at that team. We knew there was disarray within them.
Right.
But I can tell you there's an element of after the fact in terms of that, because they were so confident they were going to beat us. I mean, if you're looking at back at that, I think I haven't seen the book yet, but I had spoken to Tom English on it, and he got all excited about some of the South African sides of it, and he gets very excited about it anyway. And it's funny for a guy to be as in love with the topic that he was writing about, which he really is. And but we didn't care about anything like that. It was quite interesting. Our job was to go out and try and win a test series. And everything about that was that they were going to wipe the floor with us. So I don't know that that was bravado on their side, but that was the expectation that they had. But you couldn't step away from the fact that they couldn't kick snow off a rope. Their goal kicking stats on that was just appalling, and those 3 tests were just unbelievable. Well, the 2 tests that we won they were rubbish. They kept picking players out of position.
Yeah.
And we were laughing at not laughing at it, because there's no fun in scrummaging, I tell you, against beasts of men like they are. But they thought they were going to kill us in the first test. And their expectation afterwards was, when they didn't kill us in the pack in the first test, they would absolutely kill us in the second test. And I don't know that there's any change of an attitude. They felt that actually if they could go and overwhelm us physically, that's how they would win. But our discipline was pretty incredible for the 2 tests. Our accuracy and technical prowess, Paul Wallace's pretty outstanding locking of the scrum, meant that we kept using their weight against them. Now, with all the best will in the world, there could have been disarray behind them, and I'm sure that there was. But their game plan was to grind us down and kick the points. They didn't pick a kicker. They picked players out of position, and they couldn't grind us down. So for me, I don't care what they think in terms of that. I think that they still were in an opportunity to do it. Would we have done something else if we had to, if they were kicking the kicks over? I think we would have played differently. The manner in which we played for the matches that weren't the tests, there was tries everywhere. We played a far more open style. But when we got to the tests, we dealt with what was in front of us. So, I'm not offended by what they think of us. It doesn't bother me what they thought of us. The only thing that we were there to try and do was to actually get a win.
Yeah, I didn't suspect you would be that bothered. I mean, it's not the most magnanimous thing of them to say, but I didn't suspect you'd be losing sleep either.
No, it isn't. But it is one of the things that I would still hold to South African rugby. So I was at the World Cup final in Tokyo, and the manner in which they won and played, I loved. They played with heavy hitting forwards, but they also played with magic in their back line, with 2 of the smallest guys playing in the World Cup in Faf de Klerk and Cheslin Colby. They were outstanding. It was a great joy of mixing power with elusiveness and skills, and so that was fantastic. But still, the core belief of South African rugby is that you have to intimidate them in the forwards, which they did do in the final. But the way to try and beat them, which is what's going to be interesting for the Lions going down there, is you have to meet that challenge. But I don't think you want to play exactly in the manner in which they're playing. So don't run at their chest, run at their arms, run at as much elusiveness as you can possibly have. But where they're strongest, you try and depower them. And look, it becomes one of the issues I have when we see a huge number of South Africans playing around the world, that everybody thinks that that's the way that you have to play, because it is a winning way of playing. But there are other ways of playing too. So it's funny, I go back to that tour, and at the high point of my career, and I was young, and it was still the high point of my career, which I wish I had more high points afterwards. But it was unbelievably difficult. It was incredibly hard. But they would have won it if they had a goal kicker.
Yeah, that's a big. I mean, they talk about that in the book at length, that they should have addressed that, and that's when they say disarray and picking players out of position was a massive bone of contention for a lot of them as well. And the goal kicker, look, their point probably stands. They didn't help themselves, but sure, that's life, I suppose.
But sure, we took the risk of picking a mercurial 10 in Gregor.
Yeah,
and Gregor is the most extraordinary rugby player. But there's times he might do things that nobody else was on his page with. And he didn't, as it turned out, on the Lions. But he wasn't picked as a kicker. We picked Neil Jenkins at 15. He was the furthest thing from a 15. And he really was. He wasn't a good 15.
Well, a few of them in the book as well, again, kind of ruminating on their own failings, wonder, why didn't we bomb the ball down in Jenkins a lot more? They didn't seem to.
Well, they did one. In 2 tests, and he didn't get into the postcode to catch it.
Yeah, so you'd think we'll do that again.
Absolutely, if it works, do it again. Yeah. But I'll tell you what, if you were asking me to play a game in the morning, I would somehow fit Neil Jenkins into the team. And one of the interesting elements for me when I look back on the Lions tour was I thought he kicked every kick. He missed a few as well. I actually didn't think he missed a kick on tour. The sense of confidence and the emotion I have when I see Neil Jenkins go to kick a ball is that he puts it over. I just never thought of anything other than that. They couldn't put it over, but I never thought he missed. But he did. He missed a few.
Yeah. It's when clock's against me. There's a Peter Clossy story in it as well. I'm going to ask you about that another time because the clock is against me, and it's.
Okay.
I suspect we may come back to the '97 tour at some stage over the next 6 to 8 weeks. But on Jenkins, dry retching or even getting sick before games, it turns out in the book he says to Tom English, even as part of the Welsh coaching staff, not playing the games, the retching has continued, which is just unbelievable. It's not getting any easier for him.
I think that's just hilarious. I mean, look, I was one of the guys retching in the first test. I used to do that when I was much younger, and I got rid of it then. It never happened, I think, after that tour.
Right.
And actually, when one guy retches, there's always about 3 or 4 immediately follow in after him. But how could he do that and be so calm 10 minutes later?
Yeah.
He literally couldn't hold himself together in the changing room.